and welcome back to my channel. Bonsoir et re-bienvenue sur ma chaîne. My name is Muriel, and this evening I will be doing a dual review for both Little Big by John Crowley and Thomas the Rhymer by Ellen Kushner. As you can see, both of these are part of the Fantasy Masterworks collection. Now, it has been a hot minute since I've done a dual review for two completely unrelated works of fiction. The last one I did, in fact, I'm pretty sure was in 2020 when I did a dual review for both Rendezvous with Rama by Sir Arthur C. Clarke and Ringworld by Larry Niven. In this case, I decided I wanted to review both of these as a pairing and compare them because they both feature, it's not so much a theme as like a narrative motif, and that is basically fairies, to put it very simply. Fairies, fairyland, lore, folklore to do with the fae, elves, things like that. Indeed, for Little Big, I would qualify it, or classify it more accurately, as light, folkloric, sort of urban fantasy. I mean, there's an important urban component, though it also takes place in the countryside, so take that with a grain of salt. In the case of Thomas the Rhymer, it is also light, folkloric historical fantasy because this takes place in the early Middle Ages in Scotland and has a fairly decent historical setting most of all, and it does feature fairyland as well. Whereas Little Big takes place over several decades, also has a bit of a family saga aspect to it, I'll come back to that, but otherwise takes place more or less during, the 20th century? And yeah, it takes place both in the countryside and in the city of New York, so that's the urban fantasy element. I'll be, once again, trying my best not to spoil too much of either of these books' plots, but first I'll give synopses for both of them, as usual. So, Little Big, like I said, is a bit of a family saga. It takes place over several decades and several generations, it follows several generations of a family called the Drinkwaters, and the Drinkwaters, for some reason, are linked to fairyland. The founding member of this family was gifted with occult ability. She could read the tarot and could see fairies, basically, and this gift is passed down to her descendants, who can, especially when they're younger, see fairies, interact with them, and for some reason the fairy folk are interested in this family, and they are supposed to be intertwined with something called the Tale, which has a beginning, a middle, and an end in this book. It's not really a spoiler, you get this in the introduction, basically. So yeah, it follows the members of this family through several generations and their entanglement with the Fae world. I will already say this now, though, I did not like this novel, though it won't be a rant review by any means. I won't even be that ranty. I'm just saying I didn't really like this. I didn't find there was that much going on in this book. So I gave a synopsis for the plot, but in my opinion, there isn't much plot to speak of. Ultimately, there is this tale, there is this supposed entanglement between the fairy folk and this family called the Drinkwaters, and the Drinkwaters reside in a house, a special house called Edgewood, which is supposed to be represented on the cover, and Edgewood is supposed to be like this liminal place between the mundane world and the fairy world, but I personally think that element is way overstated in the synopsis on the back cover. Whereas with Thomas the Rhymer, like I said, this is more of a historical folkloric fantasy setting. This takes place in, I think, early medieval Scotland. It is based on a either historical or semi-historical figure of Thomas the Rhymer, who was apparently a great harpist and singer and teller of tales in medieval Scotland. And so here, basically, Thomas the Rhymer gets carted off to Elfland. It's called Elfland in this book, but Elfland is the same thing as fairyland, the she, that kind of folklore, basically. And then, again, this is not really a spoiler, becomes unable to lie, which is it's a common trope of fairy lore, to be fair. And so, yeah, it's a historical setting, medieval Scotland. It takes a look at Thomas the Rhymer, his main relationships, his voyage to fairyland, and what he gets out of that voyage, which is principally the gift of truth-telling, which includes basically seeing into the future and things like that. And it's a fairly short tale. I will already also mention that I preferred this to Little Big. It was a fairly simple book as well. It wasn't great. It was nice. It was warm and sweet, and obviously I'll explain why. So let's take a look at the writing. For Little Big, I will give it this. It was fairly well written. There is a fairly oniric quality to the writing. The story is fairly dreamlike. I think that is one of the points of this book, maybe, but still, I don't think it makes up for the lack of plot or for the lack of coherent world building or theming, which I'll get to in a minute, obviously. So yeah, dreamlike writing, so it gives you a dreamlike atmosphere, which was very nice at times. I did get fairly immersed at times in the especially countryside atmosphere surrounding this supposedly magical house of Edgewood, yes. I will mostly give points for like the narration and descriptions, or I mean descriptive passages. When it came to dialogues or interior monologues, sometimes the writing did feel a bit off actually. I didn't feel like that's how people would talk, like even a few decades back. At times it felt just a bit weird, clunky. Now maybe that family, the Drinkwaters, is supposed to be a bit weird and flighty and distracted because of their entanglement with the world of Faerie, but still, I don't know. Reading it, I just couldn't quite buy it. It is a several points of view story. I mean, you do get several different characters belonging to this family of the Drinkwaters. You get to spend some time with the different generations. However, I will say that the page count allotted to each generation and the characters belonging to each generation was very uneven. You fly through the chapters given to like the first couple of generations of Drinkwaters, and then you spend, a quarter, even a third of the book with the latest generation, and within that latest generation, more specifically, the son, one of the Drinkwaters' sons, who is called Oberon, pretty obvious reference to fairy lore there, and so he spends a lot of time in New York with one of his uncles, I think it's his uncle, and with his love interest. I didn't find that part of the book that engaging or interesting personally, not to mention I wasn't a big fan of like the love story between this young man Oberon and his love interest called Sylvie. It was just whatever. And yeah, the pacing was glacial. I don't bore easily in a book. Something like The Mists of Avalon, for example, is objectively a slow-paced book. It's a story also spanning decades, but it's one of my favorite novels of all time, so I don't necessarily mind a slow-paced book. But things do need to happen, or I need to get some meat on those literary bones, right? And here I didn't get much of anything, really. So I was actively bored at times, which is not something I usually experience with any kind of book. Even books I don't really like, I haven't felt bored like this in quite a while, to be perfectly honest. Now, in the case of Thomas the Rhymer, I would say it was nicely written, perhaps less obviously lyrical and oniric than what you get in Little Big, but it was well written. There was a certain lilting quality to it, perhaps even, not quite a musical quality to it, but something reminiscent of old ballads, of old oral tales, of, the oral literature of that time period, the early medieval ages, before written literature really was a thing. So yeah, it put me in mind of that, and that was quite nice. It is a multiple points of view story as well. There are 4 points of view, and each point of view corresponds to a part of the book. And as to the pacing, again, it is a slower tale, though I wasn't bored like I was with Little Big, and I would definitely not call this a glacial pace. So yeah, it was fine. I had said in my very recent book haul video that I had gotten very slight Mists of Avalon-like or Arthurian mythos-like vibes. I somewhat still stand by that statement. There is a bit of that because really it takes place in that particular time period and references classical Celtic-derived fairy lore a lot. But it's an atmosphere that I really enjoy, and I enjoyed it with Thomas the Rhymer as well. And then I was also left wanting with regards to the character work. Now, I'm fairly sure that this is primarily meant to be a character-driven novel, because, like I said, there isn't much plot to speak of, and thematically and world-building-wise, it also felt very lackluster. At times, I even felt it was uncommitted to its SFF assignation. So I thought to myself, well, all right then, give me a halfway decent familial saga then, with some fantastical elements attached. But the thing is, I didn't think the character work was that good. I thought it was fairly surface-level stuff. Another problem is that the characters you are presented with, though, these members of the Drinkwater family, they're all strangely passive. And it goes back to this very bare plot thread of this family being entangled in a tale orchestrated presumably by the Fae. So they have a very passive outlook on life. They're just supposed to be part of the tale. They have a set destiny, presumably controlled by the fairies, and so they wait for things to happen. And so they don't really initiate much of anything themselves. It's strange. And it's not just an issue for the female characters. Some commenters on Goodreads I've seen pointed to that being really off-putting to them, but honestly it's a problem with the male characters as well overall. The one exception perhaps being this Oberon chap who does stuff in New York with his lover named Sylvie. And there's also this secondary character called Ariel Hawksquill, which you get towards like the 2/3 mark of the book. And she has a somewhat interesting part to play, but then it never really goes anywhere concretely speaking. So yeah, it just wasn't much to sink my teeth in there. And like I said, there's an uneven amount of pages allocated to each generation of the Drinkwater family, which was also disappointing because, fine, I mean, you get a big chunk of Oberon and Sylvie lusting it out in New York, which just wasn't to my personal preference. I would have enjoyed spending more time with some of the older characters of this family, but okay, whatever. Like I just said, the romance was just bleh. It wasn't horrifically bad either, but it was just very insta-lusty doesn't necessarily bother me that much. But yeah, that's just the thing. This relationship had insta-lust, which is fine, but then that was confused for like true love and real feelings of attachment. So it became insta-lovey, and so that's just not my thing at all. And then I do have to mention it, in and of themselves, you know, I can just ignore those little bits. But given I didn't really like this book and didn't find much about it appealing at all, they were just little sour bitter cherries on top of the soggy cardboard cake, as I put it in my written review on Goodreads. You do have cringy sexual elements. Nothing explicit, don't worry. But there is a scene that would basically qualify as a sleep rape, which, you know, could have done without. And then also, it's insinuated that a character basically had sex with his own daughter, and he didn't mind so much. And I'm like, if you're a man and you suspect this young, pretty woman coming up to you of being your own flesh and blood, would you be so cavalier about having sex with her? Methinks not for the vast majority of men. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think so. And this dude just blithely went ahead and had sex with this character who he suspected might have been his own daughter. And I'm like, all right. Again, like, minor little details, which I could just ignore in most cases, but I mean, it just added insult to injury just a tad. With Thomas Thalweimer, I also actually think this is primarily a character-driven novel, or at least that's how I personally read it. Character-driven stories are not my preference, but I can still enjoy them if they're well done. So in this case, I didn't think the character work was that good either. It wasn't terribly deep. Again, it is a fairly short tale as well, but I don't know. It touched me more than it did in Little Big. And I do think that the different main characters were fleshed out in a more distinctive and thus satisfying way than they were in Little Big. And in Little Big, you have several different characters. I mean, you're even given a family tree of this Drinkwater family to keep track of the different members of that family. Here you just had 4 main characters, and the characterization was fairly surface level, but still felt better done, really. I don't know. I can't really explain it rationally, but I cared more about these characters. They felt distinct from one another, like I said. You do get a bit of background about them, but they all had their own unique notes, I guess, to them, if we're going to go with the ballad musical analogy, right? And I do think there was an interesting contrast presented between the human characters and the characters Thomas encounters in Elfland. And I mean, again, the characters in Elfland rely on a lot of classical tropes, which derive from classical lore about fairyland, really. So I didn't mind that at all. I thought it was well done. It respected, you know, the traditional lore around these beings, these creatures. So that was actually pretty well realized. So now let's delve a little more deeply into the world building, or try, because it's quite hard to do given there's not that much there once again. As I already mentioned, I felt at times that this book was weirdly uncommitted to its presumably SFF nature or assignation, and so I was expecting it to work better as just, you know, a more literary familial saga with some more magical realism elements, I guess. Overall, you are presented with bits and pieces of fantastical world building, but they felt very loose-knit and muddled, and like they didn't really know where they were supposed to fit or how they were supposed to fit all together to create a cogent and rich narrative whole. And I mean, the pitch for this book is an involvement of, you know, fairies, and you've got this supposedly magical house, this liminal house, standing as a kind of borderland between the mundane world and the world of Faerie. And it was just massively underwhelming. Like, not that much happens in this house of Edgewood, and I mean, a lot of the action takes place in the city of New York, and you're not even present at Edgewood. There's nothing that magical or magically liminal about this house. And, well, there weren't enough fairies, really. The fairy action was relatively minor, all things considered. You do get a couple of, like, fairy interventions and fairy characters, but it never really goes much of anywhere. I mean, there are references to, again, classic classical fairy lore, folklore, which were nice little nods, I guess, but it never amounted to much of anything. And in the end, it became more annoying than anything else, if I'm being perfectly honest, because I was just done with this book really in my mind. You've got a couple of world-building threads which are introduced, but again, nothing really happens with them, and they don't even really make sense within the story being presented to you. They don't really fit. I mean, without really spoiling much of anything, there is a character in this book which is a resurrected Holy Roman Emperor. And I was like, what? I was like, what the F? Just why though? How does that fit with fairy lore and the rest of the story? I just did not get that at all. That just flew straight over my head. I thought it was a bit silly, to be perfectly honest. One point I will give though is that this book does feature the concept of memory palaces. So if you're unfamiliar with that concept, basically in the old world, or in antiquity, some Roman, Greek, again I'm a bit fuzzy on the exact details, educated people would create these imaginary structures in their minds to help them remember things. Since, there weren't any smartphones, there weren't any data banks, there weren't any clouds at the time. If you wanted to remember stuff, you had to pack it all in your mind, right? And so people developed techniques to really hone their memorization skills. And that gave birth to the idea of the memory palace. So it's a palace in your mind where each item, each room, each piece of furniture is actually linked to a specific memory, a memory of an event, a memory of a person, a memory of an emotion. And this could get quite complex. And another author slash thinker who really used and developed this concept of the memory palace was, I think, Giordano Bruno, who was a Renaissance mystic slash esotericist. Now, I've encountered the concept of the memory palace in another novel years ago, and I found it absolutely fascinating. I read up on it afterwards, and so I was quite surprised to see it featured here. I was like, oh, the memory palace, I know what that is. So that was kind of neat. But ultimately, once again, it doesn't really amount to much for the overall story or lack thereof. So, again, make of it what you will, really. And so for Thomas the Rhymer, this is much more straightforward in a way because you have a, I think, fairly accurate-ish depiction of this medieval Scotland setting. I think it was well done, the vocabulary depicting different tools, different crafts of the time felt decently convincing to me. It's not a historical novel either, it's historical fantasy, but you get the gist, I think. And, you have Elfland. And the way Elfland is described, its elements just rely a lot, like I said, on traditional classic fairy lore, largely derived from the Celtic pagan tradition. There really isn't that much to say about it. It was just satisfyingly well done, really, and it was nice. Just a nice tale with a nice setting and a decent amount of convincing world building for that kind of story. And so theme-wise, yeah, I just don't have that much to say for either of these, by the way. In the case of Little Big, I guess the only thing I could really point to is perhaps the conflict between lack of agency and exercising free will, maybe? I'm not sure because, like I said, there isn't that much plot to speak of. The world building doesn't really coalesce into something meaningful or that interesting. And theme-wise, yeah, it's pretty empty as well. Perhaps I'm missing something. I'm willing to admit that. And it just didn't work for me. It didn't become apparent to me. But so to me, beyond, perhaps somewhat of a conflict between free will and predestination, because this family, the Drinkwaters, are enmeshed with the machinations of fairyland. But you never really understand what the fairies are up to, what they want. There are vague mentions of a war. I'll leave it at that if you don't want to be spoiled. But I was like, so what was the point? What was the point of all this? Why was this family enmeshed with the fairies? And like I said, they're all very passive. Why are they waiting around for stuff to happen when they don't really know what they're supposed to be expecting? So yeah, they let themselves be led, I guess, by the expectation of being contacted and, I don't know, moved about by the fairies. So they lack agency in that regard. But then some characters try to rebel against that, but ultimately doesn't, once again, amount to much. So yeah, perhaps that, but it definitely wasn't developed in any particularly interesting way or convincing way. And so in the case of Thomas the Rhymer, yeah, I don't really have much to say there either. I don't know, it was a nice little tale without much of a point, I guess. It sounds meaner than I mean it to. I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing, to be fair. Perhaps there's a slight point made about the importance of community, of family, of belonging with your loved ones, and perhaps not valuing enough what's in front of you, and you only realize how much you cared when those things / people are taken away from you, because Thomas the Rhymer goes to Elfland for 7 years and is all cut off from the people he cares about. So perhaps that. So some concluding remarks. In the case of Little Big, I rated this at a 4 out of 10. It's the 4th most disappointing book I've read in 2021, which is not the worst it could be, right? But yeah, I was expecting a lot more from this book and was sorely misled by the synopsis on the back cover, let me tell you. So, not much plot to speak of, very lackluster world building and theming. I mean, there is next to no theming, really. And it's really too bad because I feel like there were sketches of interesting ideas present in this book. I mean, there is the concept of the Memory Palace, which I personally find fascinating, but not much is really made of it ultimately. So yeah, disappointing, and I mean, lackluster character work as well. A couple of cringy bits, which ultimately I could put aside, but on top of everything else, it was just meh. So yeah, and just, I was bored. I was quite honestly bored. There were a couple of times I thought, should I just DNF this? But no, I pushed on through and was not rewarded for it. Would I recommend it? Well, no, not personally, but I mean, ultimately, maybe you will get something out of it. There is a nice oniric quality, like I said, to the writing and to some of the atmosphere present in the book, and I was sucked in at times. To me, it doesn't really justify the lackluster quality of everything else about this book, but perhaps you will get something out of it that I just couldn't for whatever reason. In the case of Thomas the Rhymer, like I said at the very beginning of the video, it wasn't great, but it was nice. It was a decent to good little tale set in medieval Scotland featuring Elfland. And that's about it. So it was a fairly simple, straightforward story. But it felt warm, is the best way I can put it. It felt nice and warm. And I did get a greater emotional impact from this tale than I did from Little Big, like no question about that. I did get some emotion out of this, so I guess on that basis alone I could recommend it. If you've got, a couple of hours to kill, you want to down another Fantasy Masterworks, you could do worse than go with this one. It's short, like I said, it's about 260 pages. It reads very quickly. I mean, the pacing is more slow than anything else, but you can read it very quickly, and if you want to, immerse yourself in that kind of setting and that kind of folklore, then yeah, you could do worse than pick this one up. So, did I mention the rating? No, I don't think so. I gave this a decent solid 6 out of 10. So that concludes my dual review for both Little Big by John Crowley and Thomas the Rhymer by Alan Kushner. I think that kind of wraps up my foray into the Fantasy Masterworks collection, though if you have another title you think I would enjoy in that collection, please leave a suggestion in the comments down below and I'll look it up. Hope you will have a lovely day, evening, or whichever time of day you prefer. As usual, do take good care of yourselves if you can, and I shall see you in the next video. Bye bye.